Well, good morning. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Canada Institute's 12th Cross-Border Energy Forum. My name is David Biette. I'm director of the Center's Canada Institute. For those of you who don't know the Wilson Center, it's your first time here, we're the United States Memorial to the 28th President. Other presidents got marble, Woodrow Wilson being the only president with a PhD, and former president of Princeton and governor of New Jersey, got an institution where people dialogue. He always believed that scholars and policymakers ought to speak with each other, and this is what we do here. So welcome. And the Canada Institute was founded in 2001. We exist to bring Canada and Canada-U.S. relations to policymakers and opinion leaders in Washington. We also do the occasional program in Canada to keep up with what's going on there and to bring some of Canada-U.S. relations to Canada. As I said, this is our 12th forum. On your welcome pack that we gave you, there's a list of the others. We try to pick an issue that there's a good cross-border debate on, and we've managed to do these about every 6 months. Today's presentation is being webcast. Just this morning's portion here, the first hour, and it will be archived on our website. And it's to stimulate the discussion, which will happen later, which is moderated and Chatham House rules only. There will be no webcast. It won't be recorded. Please don't attribute remarks to people when you leave. But we've had some really rich discussions in the past, and I hope we can have that again today. I'd like to thank my staff, particularly Ken Christ, for putting this together. Yeoman's job on that. And I'd also like to thank our partner in this, Lorraine Royer in Global Public Affairs, and her team in Calgary. Just some housekeeping. There's publications outside. If you didn't get the bios and the list of people attending, that's out by the name tags. There'll be coffee and tea throughout, and washrooms are out to the left. So with that, enjoy the morning, and we'll come with some more housekeeping regarding lunch after the program. Over to you, Lorraine.
Thanks, David. I also want to, when we said it last night and again this morning, but thank very much our sponsors, Chevron and the Canadian Embassy, for helping us put this on today. This forum, Dave talks about how we try to pick a topic of cross-border debate. This one isn't so much debate as common exploration, I think, and it's no secret to anybody in this room that natural gas is a very highly integrated North American enterprise. Over the past few years, the natural gas supply picture has changed as the new drilling, new shale gas, new technology has come into play. I think pretty soon we have to stop calling it new because there's a lot of supply and it's well established in a lot of areas and growing. But this mass production of unconventional natural gas has the potential to affect debate over electricity generation and CO2 emissions, shift regional economic balances in North America, because there's discoveries in areas where there hasn't been much development, if any, before, populous areas, concerns about development. It can facilitate development of intermittent renewable sources like wind and solar because of the peaking power from natural gas and this advanced supply. So this is timely. I know sometimes we talk about how the industry has gotten there before, no problem, the government and regulation, which is something I hope Stephen can talk to us about and others in the room. My job is also to introduce Robert Johnston, who is going to moderate this session, and he's going to be the boss today. But Robert's going to help us make sure that we invite people in the room who can participate in the dialogue and expect participation in the dialogue. So once these gentlemen up front have given you their perspectives this morning after the coffee break, we're going to make sure the whole room gets in on the discussion. Robert, I'm flipping. Robert Johnston is the director of the Eurasia Group's Global Energy and Natural Resources practice. He specializes in oil, gas, power generation, metals, and agriculture research. Now, Robert is from Ontario originally, has been, I think, away for quite a while. But I also understand he's going to go visit Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, in my home province next week for the first time, bring a parka. He has done a lot of interesting work in his history on political risk research, regulatory and strategic insight in global energy equities and electrical utilities. And we're really pleased to have Robert help us moderate this session this morning. Thanks, Robert. And I think you've got it right there.
Thank you, Lorraine. I appreciate it. And thank you to everyone for coming out this morning here to the Woodrow Wilson Center for what should be a very interesting discussion. And thanks very much to the folks at the Canadian Embassy and Woodrow Wilson Center for inviting me to moderate. I greatly look forward to the opportunity. I've been asked to offer a few introductory comments before turning to the true experts here to my left, and I'll do so very briefly. And what I'd like to do is just try to highlight a few themes I think would be worth considering. I suspect many of these will already be in the minds of the speakers, but in case they're not, maybe they'll prod some additional thoughts going forward. I think the title of this event is extremely well chosen. I think that the idea of the unconventional gas revolution and whether or not it is truly transformational or just a case of wishful thinking, I think the debate is open. And in our business, where we work with both producing and consuming companies, as well as investors in those companies in the natural gas sector, the debate is quite lively, shall we say, in terms of which one of those visions is actually in place. And I think it's really the velocity of change which has driven so much uncertainty. To think that 4 or 5 years ago, the National Petroleum Council and folks like Alan Greenspan were talking about a gas supply shortfall in the U.S. and LNG imports growing to up to 30% of the market over the next 20 years or so. And now we're in a radically different environment, as we'll see over the next couple hours. But I do think that speed of that change and those assumptions is driving uncertainty. And I think that the uncertainty is along several areas, which I'll mention briefly. One, of course, is that we've seen a significant decoupling between the price of oil and the price of natural gas. That historic 6-to-1 ratio on an energy basis between those two commodities is no longer holding. So I'd be interested to know views today on whether anyone thinks that we'll see a recoupling at some point. And a lot of that will probably have to do with the risk to both the supply and demand side for natural gas. I think that another big theme is that if you listen to some of the major unconventional gas producers, the Encanas and Anadarkos and Exxon, folks like that, you'll start to hear them talk a lot about the need for new markets for natural gas. There's so much unconventional gas coming online that there's a need for promoting fuel switching, see a greater gas burn in the power sector. But fuel switching alone may not be enough, and some of the companies are promoting natural gas vehicles. You've got folks like Dow Chemical CEO out there talking about more industrial use for natural gas to take advantage of the supply growth increases. So I think many of the risks are as much on the demand side as they are on the supply side, and that'll be a good topic for discussion this morning. Even some folks in Canada, as you may know, in Alaska as well, are talking about exporting some of the shale gas, either through Kitimat or through an expansion of the Alaskan LNG facilities. So I'm sure there'll be some interesting views on that. Of course, we can't ignore the environment. The public, I mentioned this idea of velocity of change and the newness of shale gas and other unconventional gas technology. The public, especially in non-traditional areas like Pennsylvania, very concerned about the environmental impact, whether it's fracking, whether it's the safety of well construction, which obviously is a very high-profile issue now after the spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And I think the average guy on the street thinking about cementing, for wells. I mean, these are issues that people are learning about and focusing on a lot more. And I expect Washington to take more of an interest in that particular area. And also the sheer volume of water that's used and what you do with the produced water from coal bed methane and shale gas extraction. Other issues we can consider, we have seen a significant push towards consolidation in the unconventional gas sector. Are smaller producers being driven out by larger producers? Is that a good thing? What will the role of smaller producers be going forward? How does government policy impact that outlook? Is it the case that increasing regulation will make it more difficult for the smaller producers? What about the role of non-U.S. companies and non-Canadian companies coming to the North American market? National oil companies from emerging markets, sovereign wealth funds, another important story in terms of foreign direct investment. And then we can't forget that this is a global story and that our focus here is primarily North America, but we increasingly talk about a global gas market. And I think that we can start by talking about differences between the Canadian regulatory approach and outlook for unconventionals in Canada versus the approach here in the United States, but also can perhaps consider what may happen in places like Poland and China, Hungary, that are also looking at their own unconventional gas plays as well. And Finally, I think what really ties all these different threads together is, and Lorraine mentioned this, that the industry has really outpaced government, and the regulatory response is only really beginning now to this new emerging technology. What is the appropriate role for public policy here? I think there's consensus about the role of public policy on environment and safety for this process, but much less consensus on what kind of intervention should the Canadian and U.S. governments make in the markets to encourage new demand, to encourage fuel switching, consider projects like exports. So I think that'll be an interesting discussion here from the speakers as well. So those are a few initial thoughts to start the discussion here today. But as I said, I'd like to turn to the true experts here over the next hour, and each speaker will have 10 minutes. And as mentioned, Lorraine will be keeping track of the time, so I'm off the hook for that, of being bad cop. But I'd like to start with Mr. Lee Fuller. And Lee is the Vice President of Government Relations for the Independent Petroleum Association of America, and has been there since 1998, and is responsible for coordination of legislative and regulatory issues. I believe everybody has the copies of the biography, so I won't go through the whole thing and save that time for the speakers. So Lee, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. The Independent Petroleum Association of America is a trade association here in Washington that represents independent producers, basically the upstream part of the industry. We have independent producers drill about 90% of the wells in the United States now, produce about over 80% of the natural gas and about 65% of the oil. And clearly the shale gas development is one of the areas where independent producers have been at the forefront. The development of the Barnett Shale, which kicked off most of this activity, was done by independent producers, and they are active in all the various shale plays around the United States, and I'm sure they're also starting to look at what other opportunities they may have to take that technology around the world. What I want to talk a little bit about the background on shale, and a little bit about some of the challenges that we face on the producing side of this issue. I'm sure many of you are familiar with shale gas, but just to kind of put it in some perspective, these are formations that my geologist friends will characterize as the source rock of natural gas. That is, that if we look at where gas has come from in conventional formations, it eventually was a result of movement from shale formations into pockets where they could be found. So this is really, in some senses, viewed as the mother lode of gas formation. I would also say we're starting to see a lot of movement towards developing similar formations in oil, like the Bakken Shale and some new formations that I'm hearing about in southeastern Wyoming. But what we see in terms of the way that this resource is developed is that we're dealing with a formation that tends to be 1 mile to 2 miles below the surface. The process of getting there is to drill a vertical well down and then turn it horizontally for perhaps half a mile to a mile into the shale formation, and then use hydraulic fracturing as a way to break apart the shale and allow the gas to be freed. It was really the conflux of those two technologies, horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing, that has allowed shale gas to move from a very narrow part of the supply mix in the United States to the increasingly significant role it's now playing today. The other an aspect of that which is often overlooked is that by the use of those two technologies, it means that far fewer wells have to actually be drilled to produce the same amount of resource that conventional vertical well production would have otherwise provided. It makes it an economic option. It makes it a more environmentally limited option in terms of the impact it has on the amount of activity that has to take place to get the same amount of natural gas. As it's been developed, we are starting to see projections about what it may mean in terms of natural gas supply in the United States and implicitly elsewhere. The recent studies have suggested that shale gas will bring to bear another 100 years of natural gas supply at current volumes. That opens two big questions. One is, what does that mean from a standpoint of energy security if we just continue going along the way we are? And the other is, what does it mean in terms of looking at other opportunities to use natural gas in areas where it has either been diminished over time, like power generation, or has not been a major component of the energy mix, like transportation. And both of those are drawing considerable attention, and rightfully so. It raises some questions with respect about its traditional uses in the context, I think, of industrial use. But we're seeing volumes, and we're seeing volumes, at least at this point in time, at prices that are well within, I think, most people's perspective of what would be an economically viable fuel price for a wide variety of these uses. In some cases, prices that are well below the alternative energy source. So on the positive side, we see an enormous amount of benefit from the potential of natural gas. What are the challenges? What can prevent that from occurring? Well, looking at this, one from a Washington perspective, where I deal primarily with what Congress or the administration may or may not do to my operations, and also from the standpoint of the challenges that we're facing in the development stages of this process throughout the country, as well as the role of independent producers. There's two broad areas that we tend to look at most intensively. One is the capital question. How much capital will it take, and where will that capital come from? And the other is the regulatory network in which we will operate. From a capital perspective, independent producers essentially invest the money that they receive through the wellhead. They don't have an array of other parts of their business that allow them to have capital flowing to them from those businesses. So what they earn through the wellhead is what they are able to invest, plus what they can borrow. Historically, over the past decade or so, we've seen investment levels of roughly 150% of domestic U.S. cash flow back into new U.S. projects. Now, that was at a time when credit was a little different than it is right now, so I'm not sure we're able to sustain that level of activity. But what we do look at are things that could impinge on our capital flow and impinge on our ability to maintain that capital flow. That's drawn us into, for example, an issue we never thought we'd be involved in, and that is the financial reform bill with respect to commodity markets. Why? Because over the past decade or so in particular, hedging of our natural gas production has become a critically important facet in managing your capital flow as an independent producer. Independent producers will go into the market, primarily the over-the-counter market, where they can use their resources as their collateral, and hedge 2-3 years of some portions of their production in order to stabilize their capital flow. What does that mean? It means they can plan their drilling budgets much more carefully. So why are we concerned about what's happening in the financial reform bill? Well, most of the effort in the financial reform bill has been designed to try to drive trading to regulated exchanges. On regulated exchanges, you have to provide your collateral with cash, in essence, and you have daily closing requirements daily clearing requirements that you have to make to adjust your position relative to the market. That would consume an enormous amount of capital that's now being put into the drilling operations in just holding your position in the hedging market. So far, we've been reasonably successful in convincing the Congress that our hedging operations is not a systemic risk to the overall financial world, and in fact is beneficial. And we have been able to achieve an end user provision that allows us to continue to use the over-the-counter market. It doesn't really address the question of who our counterparties are going to be going forward, and that obviously raises some concerns. But in terms of the immediate issue that we were worried about, we've been able to make some steps forward in order to retain the flexibility to do the kind of hedging that we've done in the past. The second area that we deal with in our relationship with Congress is taxes. Because, our our investment comes out of our cash flow, to the degree that tax policy changes and taxes are taken, that means that we have less revenue to invest. The administration has proposed a series of tax proposals that were designed to basically repeal a wide variety of tax provisions, some of which have been in the tax code since it was formed, and the loss of those can impinge on our ability to have the capital that we need to continue to develop this resource base. The regulatory arena is one that's probably drawn more attention, and most notably probably in the context of hydraulic fracturing. This is a technology that's been used for 60 years. It's been used over 1 million times. It's been very effective. It's been a technology that hasn't seen a history of environment. My personal background is in the environmental area. I've been around this for far more years than I care to mention, but if you read my bio, you'll figure out how long that's been. I've never seen an issue with a more benign environmental history be driven to the extent of this one. That suggests that it's causing an enormous amount of threat to drinking water that it does not. The regulatory process that affects hydraulic fracturing is one that really is associated with the construction of the wells. As someone noted, it involves cementing to some degree. Part of what we do when we drill a well, and what we've done for decades and decades and decades under state regulatory programs, has been to put a barrier between the groundwater and the wellbore. Now we do that, but whether we had hydraulic fracturing or not, you don't want oil, you don't want natural gas liquids, you don't want produced water getting into drinking water any more than you'd want hydraulic fracturing fluid. So that barrier has been very effective in preventing the movement of those fluids into drinking water, and continues to be so. But we've seen a very orchestrated effort for the past 5 years in particular, and probably closer to 10, to try to stigmatize hydraulic fracturing in a way to frighten local communities as they are in a position of making decisions about development in their areas. That's what we see in New York. It's what we see in Pennsylvania. I've seen very different responses in those states. We can talk about those more later. But it is a large, aggressive issue that we have to face. It is one of several in the environmental area: produced water, air emissions, or others. In each of these instances, we're dealing with a lot of effort on the part of people who want to reduce the ability to produce natural gas, and we'll continue to have to combat that going forward. With that, I think I'll close and let the next speaker talk.
Thank you very much, Lee. Appreciate your comments this morning. I'd now like to introduce Donald Santa Jr. Donald is the president of the Interstate Natural Gas Association of America. This is the trade group that represents the interstate and interprovincial natural gas pipeline industry. And Donald has a very interesting background you can read about, including the experience on Capitol Hill and involvement at the FERC and with some of the major, more important legislative and regulatory initiatives we've seen over the last 20 years. So with that, Don, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Robert, and thanks to the Wilson Center for the opportunity to be here. I'd like to present you with the transmission pipeline perspective on these issues. As Robert mentioned, INGA represents the interstate pipeline segment of the industry, while our primary focus is on U.S. Regulatory, legal, and legislative issues. We have got strong participation by the major Canadian owners of transmission pipeline, Alliance, Enbridge, and TransCanada. You'll notice I gave that alphabetically so as not to show any favoritism. And actually, over the past 8 years, twice we have had the CEO of one of our Canadian members as our chairman of the association. So with that, this first slide depicts the interstate pipeline network in the United States. And the point that I want to make here is it really is a very well-developed network, really a national asset. There are some 220,000 miles of interstate transmission pipeline and about 75,000 miles of intrastate transmission pipeline in the United States. And I apologize ahead of time, I did not have time to gather comparable statistics for interprovincial transmission pipelines in Canada. This is a slide that I borrowed from our colleagues up at the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association that depicts the natural gas transmission pipelines owned by their members. And I think it really emphasizes the integrated nature of the transmission pipeline network in the United States, in North America, both in terms of the physical integration and also the integration of ownership. I mean, you look at it and you note that those three Canadian companies that I mentioned earlier, in addition to having assets in Canada, have got major pipeline assets in the United States. And at the same time, you've got a big U.S. company, Spectra, which has got significant pipeline assets in Canada. This slide comes from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they note that in the last decade, FERC approved some 15,000 miles of new interstate natural gas pipeline. And I think as of the end of last year, at least 13,000 miles of that had been actually built. There are varying estimates as to the level of capital involved in this. One estimate I saw had the industry investing about $60 billion in capital over the past decade in new pipelines. I recently also saw another estimate of capital expenditures for the 5-year period 2007 through 2011, some of that being estimate that had within that 5-year span $49 billion of capital invested. One of the things I think that's even more fascinating about this is the bulk of that investment incurred in the latter half of the decade, and very much coincident with the big supply push on natural gas, first with the anticipation of more LNG coming in, but then really it got supercharged with the unconventional gas development and the need for pipeline capacity to bring that gas to market. In addition to the new pipeline capacity, storage capacity in the U.S. grew by about 25% over the past decade, and LNG terminal capacity increased fourfold. So a tremendous increase in the natural gas infrastructure. And I would contrast that with the electric transmission side, where again, based on data out of FERC, there were over the decade constructed 9 high-voltage interstate transmission lines totaling about 682 miles. Now, you may say apples and oranges comparing electric transmission and gas pipelines, but if electric transmission is oranges and gas pipelines are apples, you can't help but come to the conclusion there are a heck of a lot more apples than there are oranges out there. Last month, in its State of the Markets report that was presented by the FERC staff to the Commission, they made the point that the additions to infrastructure in the United States, to pipeline infrastructure, have probably got us as close as we have ever been to having a single national natural gas market. That there now are very few instances of pipeline congestion having an impact on prices, and that tends to occur in very few markets. Well, why has this worked so well? And I would suggest that it's because the U.S. legal and regulatory framework really supports natural gas infrastructure development very well. The fact that we've got a federal siting law that recognizes the inherent interstate character of this industry and preempts state law, provides federal eminent domain, and also a very stable economic regulatory regime that I think gives investors great confidence. One in which the FERC does not second-guess the market with regard to the need for facilities, and also one in which there is competitive entry to take advantage of market opportunities. I think that this has served us very, very well in terms of enabling the interstate pipeline industry to be very market responsive, and also enabling those facilities to both go through the regulatory process and be constructed in a relatively accelerated time frame to respond to market opportunities. This next slide comes from a report that was published by the Inga Foundation in October of 2009. The purpose of the report was to look at U.S. and Canadian pipeline infrastructure and what would be needed between 2009 and 2030. And the study forecasted that the U.S. and Canada will need between about 29,000 and 62,000 miles of new transmission pipeline between 2009 and 2030. And with much of that being based on the supply push, that is bringing new gas supply to market. The reason for that wide variance is that the study looked at 3 different scenarios, given the great uncertainties we've got about our energy future. And also a major variable, quite frankly, is whether or not the Arctic projects are constructed. The base case would project about 37,700 miles of new pipe being needed in that period, and of that, about 4,700 miles would be in Canada. The base case also projected that we would need 8.1 million horsepower of compression capacity in that period, with about 1 million in Canada, and that the base projection was that it would require about $130 billion of new capital during that period. This is a slide that I have borrowed from a presentation that was made by Steve Letwin of Enbridge. And the point being made here is that the evolving natural gas supply situation is going to create winners and losers in terms of flow along major natural gas transmission corridors. Because first, some of the historic producing basins are in decline, while others are ascendant. And also, given the fact that we're in a period of robust gas supply, price competition will affect gas flows. Producers that can supply the market at the lowest cost will gain market share, and of course others may lose market share based on that competition. As a matter of fact, even though I know that the Enbridge slide, if you read the notes, anticipates that the increased domestic supply will reduce LNG imports, there was another study I read recently by an economic consulting firm that made the case that they could foresee a scenario given the expansion of LNG liquefaction capacity around the world, given, I think was mentioned previously, the fact that you could have shale gas development in other parts of the world where LNG could be landed in the United States and be price competitive with U.S. shale gas, and in fact be competing for that market. And so I think that point, I'm not going to opine on whether that will be the case or not, but I think it really illustrates the fact that we have got a very, very dynamic gas supply situation, and one in which I think, as Robert said at the outset, if we thought at the beginning of the 2000s we were going to be supply constrained, we may in fact end up being market constrained now, given the abundance of the prospect for gas supply. So the point that I want to leave you with in closing is that the ability to construct transmission pipeline infrastructure in response to the growth in gas supply and the shifts in the location of that supply is not a major challenge. That the track record is that there is a good regulatory and legal process, there's the ability to attract the capital, and that it should not be a major impediment. And I guess one footnote and something I should have said earlier on is that in connection with this, there will also need to be constructed a lot of natural gas gathering lines, a lot of infrastructure in connection with gas processing, perhaps even liquid pipelines to deal with the natural gas liquids that are processed. And that other pipeline infrastructure tends to be subject to state authorization. So all the things that I said about the federal regime that has been so good for interstate pipelines, for that other infrastructure, it's subject to approval at the state level, and depending upon the state and its regulatory and political climate, that could or could not be an obstacle or a hurdle. With that, thank you for your attention, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Don. Appreciate your comments. Now I'd like to turn to Michael Hightower, who is with us here today from the Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And we had some good, lively discussion over breakfast about the merits of life in New Mexico versus Saskatchewan and Alaska, and I thought it was very interesting. All three sound more interesting than Potomac, Maryland, to be frankly. So Michael is here from the distinguished member of the technical staff at the Energy Security Center at Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque. Has a 30-year background as a civil environmental engineer, focused on R&D, and has particular expertise in some of the issues around water and in the energy space as well. So we'll look forward to Michael's comments this morning.
Thank you. It's good to be here. So they load my presentation. We got to hurry up because the Saskatchewan hook is back there, and she's ready. She's already telling me I got a minute to go. Shouldn't have made so many Saskatchewan jokes at dinner last night. I was asked to talk about the gas shales and the water implications that we see nationally in the United States associated with gas shale development. So I've been involved in looking at energy and water issues for the Department of Energy for the last 8 or 9 years, looking at energy security from a water standpoint, which is somewhat surprising to a lot of people because they don't realize how much water is used for energy development, whether that's water for cooling power plants or whether that's water for growing biofuels or water for fossil fuel refining and things like that. So several years ago, we were asked to start to look at this connection and interdependencies between energy and water. There's a report to Congress that I helped write that was published by the Department of Energy in 2007 on the interdependencies of energy and water. It gives a reasonable background, I think, in what the different technologies that exist today, what their water footprint is, if you will, and some of the issues that we see and trends that on water supplies and how that may limit energy development in the U.S. So I'll just move quickly. The focus, again, is on the gas shales here. I just want to set the stage for the audience on why energy development could be impacted by water supplies. And the reason is that the water supplies in the United States have been diminishing. The access to fresh water supplies, the access to groundwater resources over the last 4 or 5 decades has probably been developed in an unsustainable fashion, if you will. And so when we start looking at large energy developments that require large amounts of water, we need to look at the water supply availability. And on this slide, I just talk about the fresh surface water supply availability in the United States and the fresh groundwater supplies. In the left-hand corner, you have the available water supplies for freshwater withdrawals in the United States. And essentially, in the United States, we maxed out in freshwater supply availability in the mid-'80s. We have not built any new major reservoirs. So we're withdrawing at the maximum capacity today. One of the issues that we have is as climates change and vary, it's very possible that our surface water supply availability and withdrawal capability will actually diminish by something on the order of 10 to 15%, depending upon what part of the country you're in. So we're going to have probably less fresh surface water in the future to do energy development. The groundwater map here in the bottom right-hand corner shows the major aquifers in the United States that have been unsustainably developed. They're either impacted by overpumping or salinization. You're getting down the lower ends of the aquifer, or saltwater intrusion. And the purpose of this map is to show that generally we talk about in the United States the Great Plains aquifer, the Ogallala aquifer, and its lack of water supply and unsustainable practices. But if you look at that map, most of the major groundwater aquifers in the United States have been impacted by overpumping over the last 30 years. So a lot of people think of water issues in the United States as being issues that are predominantly a concern in the southwestern United States. But I'm trying to submit to you here that we're seeing water issues cropping up across the United States. We have huge amounts of groundwater withdrawal, 500 feet of groundwater withdrawal in Arizona and California. If you look at Chicago in the Great Lakes, they've got 900 feet of groundwater withdrawal. So there's the Midwest has major groundwater and surface water issues, as does places in the West and in the Northwest that you wouldn't think of as having groundwater supply issues. And so from a Canadian standpoint, I think that you're going to see the Great Lakes issues are going to be important to you. The groundwater issues in Washington and British Columbia are huge, as well as impacts along the Ontario and Quebec borders associated with water supplies. I think you're going to see those kinds of issues also. So essentially the bottom line here is water supplies probably on groundwater supplies are also going to be limited in the future on what's going to be able to be developed. So I think we may have hit, based upon current infrastructure, peak fresh water in the United States. Other parts of the world are seeing exactly the same kinds of issues. Australia, South Africa, of course the Mideast, but Asia and China are seeing similar issues with their water supplies. So to me, energy development is going to be impacted by water availability. So instead of just having a debate around natural resource like greenhouse gas emissions, I think we need to look at all of our natural resources as we're looking in the future to develop, and that includes the water resources. So we're going to start talking, I think, rather than just carbon footprints, we're going to talk about water footprints fairly soon. Let's see, where do I got it. And this is a figure from the General Accounting Office, General Accountability Office, on a study that was done, just to reinforce that many of the water managers across the United States are suggesting that they will see either local or regional water shortages in the next decade. So you would expect places like Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona to California to have those problems, but look at some of the states that are projecting water supply shortages, and we're talking about states like Wisconsin and Minnesota, Washington State, Idaho, and even Pennsylvania, New York. So I think as we try to develop our gas shale resources, these water shortages and water stresses that many of the water managers within these states are seeing will become a bigger issue. So here's a map of the gas shales in the United States. The way that this is drawn, nothing ever moves up into Canada, even though we know that the Canadian provinces also have significant gas shales. But so the resource is available across the United States. It looks like quite an abundant resource. And the issues I think that we're going to see is the development of this resource in areas that have not traditionally done oil and gas development. They haven't had to deal with produced water demands, well pads, environmental concerns associated with runoff from well pads and things like that. And I'll show a few slides here in a second. But you can see that the Marcellus Shale is the big shale supply that maybe is the game changer in the sense that it changes the regional distribution of natural gas in the U.S. from just a western issue to an eastern issue capability also. But what I have here on the slide is some background information on the kinds of water supplies that are required for gas shale development. We use about 3 million gallons of water per well for fracking, essentially. Some of that water is recovered, 20 to 70%, depending upon what formation you're in and what part of the country. When you do recover the water, it comes back relatively salty. The first amount of water that comes back is 10,000 parts per million TDS, which is probably about 10 to 20 times more salty than drinking water. And by the time that the end of it comes back, we're looking at 100,000 parts per million TDS, which is 3 times saltier than seawater. So the water has a significant amount of salts that have to be handled and disposed of just like you do traditional oil and gas produced water. In most cases in oil and gas production, as many people know, you do a deep well injection. And some of the concerns that we're seeing from many of the producing areas is that they do not have the formations to do deep well injection of this produced water. So it has to be handled either through a combination of treatment, which drives the cost up, or movement so that you can get it to a deep well injection site, which can be expensive, the transportation. Or in some cases they put it in publicly owned wastewater treatment plants, which kind of limits how much water that you can go in and mix and blend with treated wastewater. So those are the kind of the issues that we're seeing as far as water supply issues for these wells. Here's just a couple of pictures on what gas shale development is, as was mentioned by Lee. Most of these pads that you see there have several directionally drilled wells, so they can do 3 or 4. Most of the times, I understand they're doing 4 right now, wells per pad. But you do have the large pads. They're just as like you're drilling in the Permian Basin of West Texas and New Mexico. These are large pads that do require a lot of trucks, and so there's issues, environmental issues associated with dust and traffic and things like that. As Lee mentioned, these things are mostly 3 to 10,000 feet deep when you do the fractures, and it's to stimulate the formations to get additional gas. I do have a reference there. There is a gas shale primer that the Department of Energy, Groundwater Protection Council, and others have put out. That's a very good primer for your constituents on what are some of the issues and ramifications of gas shale development. It's available online, or if you want a copy of it, I can send it to you. To put this in perspective, I just thought it would be important. In the report to Congress that we did, we tried to rank all of the different types of water use in terms of gallons of water per million BTUs. And an average gas shale well is going to produce somewhere between 2 and 6 BCF in its lifetime. And if you look then at the 3 million gallons per well, this is what you're kind of looking at in natural gas extraction, coal gasification, coal liquefaction, and in situ oil shale. You can still see that natural gas from a water intensity standpoint is still very, very low. But the upfront issues of the millions of gallons of water per well do have some impacts on development. So I guess I'm going to put a plug in here for natural gas is pretty nice as far as being water use effective. And this is my last slide that really talks about the issues that we're seeing. The stormwater runoff seems to be the largest environmental issue today because of the size of the pads and things like that. It's a local issue, though. It doesn't occur. You don't see this kind of issue really in Texas, but you're seeing it in Pennsylvania and New York and West Virginia. The drinking water impacts, everybody is addressing the hydraulic fracturing, and it's really based upon the data we've got. It's not a hydraulic fracturing issue. It's more a well completion issue and surface casing issues. There have been very few. They're kind of anecdotal. Some states have told us that they've never had a complaint. Kind of hard for me to believe that, but it appears to me we've got to get the information out that it's not a hydraulic fracturing issue. It's a completion issue, and we need to do a better job at completing and casing these wells correctly. Finding the adequate water supplies. I think what we're going to see is currently a lot of the states are permitting 100 to 200 of these wells a year. Some of the states are telling me that they're moving up in some of these basins to 1,000 a year. There's probably not enough water supply to support 1,000 wells in some of the basins like the Susquehanna Basin. I think what you're going to see is this is going to begin to limit the gas shale development. It won't be as peaked. It will be more extended for longer periods of time. But probably, depending upon which basin you're in, it's just going to force you to not peak very fast. You'll just have to have a sustained development over 10 or 15 years. And the last one that drives the same thing is, for some of these systems, there's not a way to dispose of the produced water. So some of the ways to dispose of it and transportation are expensive, and the treatment plants can only take a certain amount. So I think that is going to limit and stabilize kind of the development long term for shale gas in many of these areas. I think we'll still be able to do shale gas. It just will not have huge spikes. You will end up with a long-term kind of level of development that the infrastructure can kind of handle, essentially around the water and wastewater issues associated with shale gas. And I think that's my last slide. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael. Look forward to coming back to that in the Q&A. I'd now like to introduce Stephen Lucas, who's here from, I believe, from NRCan in Ottawa, and is the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Mineral and Metal Sector, and has been there since April 2007. He's had a distinguished career in the federal government, including Health Canada, as well as the very well-recognized and prestigious Geological Survey of Canada. So we look forward to your comments this morning.
Thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here to participate in this forum at the Woodrow Wilson Centre. What I'd like to do is briefly just outline Canada's unconventional gas resources. But to start, perhaps I'll back up a bit to just note that, as I'm sure you're all aware, Canada has significant energy resources. We're the sixth largest energy producer in the world. And we're moving ahead on developing cleaner fossil fuels, both in terms of production and use, and diversifying our energy mix with new clean energy sources and technologies. We have 14% of the world's proven oil resources, second only to Saudi Arabia, and we're the third largest producer and second biggest exporter of natural gas in the world, as well as the second biggest producer of hydroelectricity and the world's leading producer of uranium. And although Canada remains the single largest supplier of energy to the United States, we operate in a global energy market. As a major producer and supplier of all energy types, a major exporter and supporter of international energy security, open markets, and sound regulatory regimes, our energy focus is very much global. As we all know, the energy landscape is changing. The supply portfolio in our hemisphere is shifting from one dominated by conventional resources in terms of fossil fuels to one dominated by unconventional oil and gas resources. These unconventional resources will be critical for energy security in North America and our hemisphere in the coming decades and bring their own set of unique challenges. The successful development of the world's unconventional sources such as shale gas, oil sands, and other heavier forms of crude oil are likely to represent an increasingly important addition to the world's overall fossil fuel supply in the years ahead. As we've heard, technological advances are key to bringing these types of resources to market and indeed have underpinned the dramatic developments in terms of shale gas. The North American natural gas supply portfolio is shifting from one dominated by conventional resources to one dominated by unconventional resources, particularly shale gas, as we've heard. While the development of tight gas and coal bed methane is well established in Canada, shale gas development is beginning, albeit behind the U.S. at this stage. That said, the potential is tremendous. This slide shows the historical and forecast sources of natural gas production in Canada. While total natural gas production in Canada has been in decline, unconventional gas is growing quite rapidly, as you can see in terms of tight gas, coal bed methane, and forecast shale gas production. Over the long term, unconventional gas does offer the possibility of restoring our production back to previous levels and even growing total natural gas production in Canada. On this slide, we show that illustrate the latest shale gas resource estimates released yesterday by the Canadian Society for Unconventional Gas. Original gas in place, shale resources total over 1,100 trillion cubic feet of gas. Even with a 20% recovery factor, this is a very significant resource. Noteworthy are significant resources that exist in eastern Canada, far away from the Western Canada sedimentary basin, which is the heartland of Canada's oil and gas industry. Traditional importers of gas could become significant producers, for example, in Quebec, which has historically relied on natural gas from other jurisdictions. Quebec's Utica shale formation is now fully leased. The province of Quebec has a 5-year royalty holiday in place to spur production, and recent test wells are yielding very promising results. In addition, the resource is close to premium eastern markets and existing infrastructure. On this page, I just wanted to illustrate the various stages of shale gas development across North America, from initial resource estimates through to commercial production. And the Canadian plays are highlighted with the flag. Most production is taking place, most production in the U.S. is in Stage 5 development is illustrated on the right-hand side of the slide. In Canada, only the British Columbia's Horn River and Montney shale plays are at pilot stage or commercial stage at this point. While the industry remains optimistic about shale resources in Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, they're several years behind some of the U.S. Resource plays. So to conclude, Canada has enormous unconventional natural gas resources, which will contribute to a secure supply in the long term of natural gas in North America. These resources, in particular in eastern Canada, are close to markets and existing pipeline infrastructure, providing a new, potentially low-cost supply source for those markets. Shale gas also offers the possibility of growing Western Canada sedimentary basin production over the long term. This offers a possibility of not only exporting to the U.S., but as well LNG exports to other markets, including Asia. While many of the shale plays in Canada are still in the early stages of development, the long-term prospects and expectations are looking very promising. Stop there.
Thank you very much, and it's exciting to get that presentation right after that report was released just so recently in Ottawa. So look forward to hearing more about that. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our final speaker here, Adam Szymanski, who is the chief energy economist for Deutsche Bank and certainly one of the more well-respected and well-regarded analysts on oil and gas issues in the markets. He's been at Deutsche Bank over the last several years, both as chief energy economist and as in the energy strategist for the global oil and gas equity team, and has a long series of credentials as well in various trade associations and the National Petroleum Council. So we're very much looking forward to what Adam has to say today.
Thanks a lot, Robert and Lorraine, and Stephen, thank you for ceding your remaining minutes to me. Maybe I can use the final chat here as a way of summarizing some of the things that have been said by the other speakers. And Stephen actually mentioned coal seam gas and tight gas, as unconventional as they are. The focus of the panel has been on the shale gases, but as you can see from this slide, coal seam gas, at least in 2008 with the official production numbers, was still tied with shale gas for production in the U.S. And I don't have a breakout for the tight gas, but it's fairly significant. And just by way of definition, what makes unconventional gases different is something actually that Robert and Lee mentioned earlier. Lee had talked about shale gases being the source rocks. Well, there's much broader layers, geologic layers of these source rocks than the traps, which typically involve some kind of a curvature in the geologic layers. And so there's just a whole lot more of it, and that's one of the key things about unconventional gases. This comes from Velo Kriskra, who is showing shale gas contribution out to this year. So I had the official 2008 number, which was 5.5 Bs. And if you look at Velo's numbers, he thinks that we're already up to 10. I mean, this is huge, folks. If you're trying to decide here, is this wishful thinking versus something real? The answer is this is a revolution. This is real. And I want to just give you one quick anecdote. I won't mention the company, but one of the companies who was the first to get involved in gas shales, and developed a lot of the techniques that are being used to drill and produce the shales. I visited with them just a month ago, and I said, when did you have your aha moment? And they said, what do you mean by that? And I said, when did you realize that this meant more than just something good for your company, that it was way beyond your company, that it involved lots of other companies and national and maybe even international? And the answer was the end of 2008. Right? That's only a year and a half ago that one of the premier companies operating in this space figured out that this was a revolution. Right? And I said, well, when did your competitors figure it out? Oh, they said, maybe last year. When did Washington and Ottawa figure it out? Well, I think they're just getting onto it. Really, they're just getting onto it. Right? So this is going to be fascinating. A few week ago, was it? 2 weeks ago, the EIA came out, and everybody was worried they were going to revise their shale gas numbers down because they might have miscounted who was producing it. And they knocked a half a B a day off the 2009 numbers. And those are the adjusted numbers. You can't tell that they did anything. Gas prices are down, but the rig count is climbing. We're drilling more horizontal wells now than we were a year ago and more conventional vertical wells. So the industry is figuring something out as far as the costs are concerned. Okay, so Stephen had the Canadian map, and everybody else had the U.S. map, and I've got one that covers both countries. And they were originally talking about the Magnificent Seven plays, right? And that was Barnett and Fayetteville, Marcellus, Antrim, Montney, Horn River, and what am I missing? Maybe Woodford and Fayetteville, Haynesville. Right. Now we're up to at least 13 on there. We're running out of rhyming names, right? The Nifty Nine, and we're up to the Terrific 10, and I don't know, the Keen. I'm keen on 13. So here's the conclusion of this slide. This stuff's everywhere, and that's just the U.S. and Canada. I mean, there's formations down in Mexico, and there's probably shale gases we know that they're in Europe because the companies are already trying to drill there and investigate. They're all over Canada, China, according to our China oil analyst. Right, so 100 years worth of supply, and it's cheap. I mean, the companies have figured out how to do this stuff at break-even costs at probably $3 and making money at $4. If you say, how can they do that? The answer is technology. Horizontal drilling, multi-stage fracturing, right? So now we're covering thousands of feet in a formation. And instead of just fracturing one section, you're fracturing more than one section at a time. So you've got a whole string of 5 or 6 sections that are fracked and can produce. And then somebody said, well, why are we just drilling one, hole through the formation like that? Why don't, instead of having one hole going horizontally through the formation, why don't we do that? Right, all from the same vertical hole, right? So now you're covering a fan shape of a reservoir that is somebody might say it's limitless. All right. Yes, we've talked about this. What could stop it? Regulatory issues or water. I love peak water. That's that's going to be the title of my next conference. Charlie's going to help. So, Aubrey McClendon of Chesapeake Energy just 2 days ago at a Deutsche Bank conference here in Washington was asked, what are they doing to deal with this? And Aubrey's answer was 3 things. We're going to use less water for each of the wells we drill. So instead of using 3 million gallons a well or 70,000 barrels, we're going to figure out a way to make that less. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to recycle all that water. So we're not going to treat it and dump it into the streams or sewage systems in some village. We're going to figure out a way to treat that water and send it right back down the hole. And the third thing that we're going to do is green up the fracturing fluids. So, so whatever the recipe is, it's in the fracturing fluids. We're going to, with 99% of which is water and sand, is we'll figure out, the other 1% and make sure that the things that are in there aren't going to harm reservoirs, whether they're drinking water or not. A lot of the stuff that's in those formulas, by the way, is stuff like bleach and shampoo. The stuff you have in your shower at home. Bleach to keep fungus from growing, exactly, the X14 that you spray around your shower, and shampoo to lubricate things up and clean the systems up. And I don't think it's dangerous. I think we heard that from Lee Fuller. Okay, here's another thing. We got 5 or 6 Bs a day of LNG coming on this year, and there's probably another 4 Bs a day globally coming on next year. And after that, it'll start to slow down because we haven't been doing new LNG facilities. But there's a lot of gas out there, and I think you could consider this unconventional gas too, in the sense that it's being shipped around in ways that are different than others. The conclusion here is there's a lot of gas. So what we're really running out of is not gas. We're running out of markets. And Robert talked about that. Transportation. I mean, we could burn 3 Bs a day if we figured out a way to turn every diesel truck in America to a gas-fired vehicle. Probably not compressed gas, probably some form of LNG. Do it on big trucks where you could put a big safe tank. And why LNG? Because when you compress gas, I think the ratio was 1 to 15 or something like that. If you do LNG, I think the flag just went up 5 minutes. 5, was that 5?
That was 4.
4, not a problem.
It started at 5.
Market size, if you really want to do it, you got to do it in power generation, and we'll probably see what's going to happen there with the climate bill coming up. Whether that gets passed this year or not, don't know. Replacing heating oil in the Northeast, you could go a long way right there, probably a B a day. That's currently imported heating oil. If you do a carbon tax, does it kill gas? No. Exxon looked at this very carefully before they bought their gas shale play. And Exxon's conclusion is that even a $60 a ton carbon tax, and by the way, the Kerry Lieberman bill was talking about a cap at 25 or 30. So a $30 a ton tax has gas looking very attractive. And even at $60 a ton, gas is still attractive compared to a lot of the other plays. We heard this from Lee. This is a really important one, actually. Is Congress is on a revenue hunt. They desperately need tax revenues. They're looking at tax preference items, and there's $4 billion a year worth of tax preference items that a lot of which it has been very, very important in spurring the shale gas plays. So taking this away is untimely. I mean, whether you agree that it's a good idea to take it away or not, taking it away right in the middle of when it's being used, it might not be such a brilliant idea. Very, very short term, there's a lot of gas in storage. Our projections say that we're going to be up over record storage numbers by the end of the year. That's a combination of the shale gas production doesn't want to fade away, and we still aren't getting the pickup in industrial and electric utility supplies. I think Robert also mentioned the oil-gas ratio. This is not on current or front month oil and gas prices, spot prices. This is actually on the 3-year out futures prices for both oil and gas. The reason I did that is it takes some of the short-term noise out of the numbers. And, we're currently averaging around a 12 or 13 ratio. Historically, that number, financially, BTU-wise, it's been 6, but financially it has historically averaged about 8, more recently 10. 12 is very, very unusual. That is going to spur a lot of interest in finding ways to substitute gas into oil. It's hard to do in the short run, but I can assure you that there are committees sitting around in places all over the world right now that are saying, how can we take advantage of the fact that that gas is selling for $20 when oil is selling for $75 or $80. Finally, speculation that was brought up by Lee, and as an issue associated with how a lot of the shale gas plays have been financed. The difficulty, I think, politically is this one, that all of the typical fundamentals that I think really matter, shale and coal floors and inflation and climate change and storage, weather, economic growth, Canadian supplies and imports into the United States and LNG supplies, just don't capture the public imagination in the same way speculation does. And So that speculator is that big fat target sitting out there waiting for somebody to do something. Where the reality is that a lot of the activity in those financial markets has been designed to deal with how the companies can finance their activities and smooth out those finances, as Lee said. That doesn't mean that we don't need more transparent rules and better regulations. Just as an example, personally, everything that went on in the stock market last week when 10% of my retirement funds went up in smoke in 15 minutes. It's personally, if I wanted to have that for my retirement funds, I'd just go down to Atlantic City or fly out to Las Vegas. I think that somehow or another we need to get public governmental regulations that take some of the hiccups that we've been getting in the markets, and that was a perfect example of one, out and deal with it. So thanks very much.
Thank you to Adam and all the other speakers. Let's give them a round of applause for a great comment. Well, I believe thanks to ruthless and efficient timekeeping and self-regulation, isn't that the buzzword these days? We've managed to come close to on time. So I think now we're going to move to coffee break. Thank you very much.
Is Rich Hoff?